was actually here. So,
and I actually have a cool caption for Greg here. There you go.
There we go.
I'm a smart guy.
So this is really cool because like when we started the rotation in my garage, Greg was actually one of the first guests that came on there. You were like the 4th or 5th show, and I can't remember the topic that we actually talked about, but I remember you calling me after this. Dude, that was so cool. You didn't ask me to explain the endocannabinoid system one time during the entire show. And it was so refreshing to do something with cannabis and not talk about like, mediocre stuff or, layman stuff. Cannabis. So yeah. Yeah, Greg, it's good to have you on the show.
It's good to be here.
This is an important particularly because like is a big part of my life. As most of you know, as my shirt suggests, I own a store here in Ybor City. It's right across from this building that houses this bar called the Bad Monkey. But there's a building across the street that's called the Lacada building, right? The Lacadas, as Gary was telling me, were big landowners in Ybor City or big business people here.
Back in the 1920s and 30s, yes.
But Victor Lacada played a particular role in cannabis becoming, this whole Reefer Madness, yellow journalism, being kind of getting all these stigmas behind it for schizophrenia, basically saying that cannabis is going to make you go insane, right?
Well, let's. I have a couple of pieces of graphics and a couple of articles that I brought in to go ahead and introduce Greg to your audiences in regards to the topic we're going to discuss today. Go ahead, guys, to bring up that first picture in regards to the on Biden. Here we go. I call this Biden meets Bertha. This was a conversation to opioid abuse that happened back during the time that we had the primaries going on. And of course, there's Biden sitting there clapping because the lady on the far right, Dr. Bertha Madras, one of our favorite people, had just finished discussing the fact that she felt that when it came to cannabis use to reduce opioid addiction, there's just hasn't been a long enough longitudinal study for this to make a difference. And so therefore, it is disrespectful to the patients to even assume that cannabis could possibly treat cannabinoid addiction, when in fact, it is one of the major causes of increasing amounts of psychosis across the country. And as you can see, that picture, Biden was clapping. Welcome to the new America, and welcome to the knowledge of the fact that we need to do more work on this, and we need to help educate the president-elect, and that is where we're coming from. But Bertha Madras was part of what I called the traveling Cassandras that came to the Florida legislature over the last 2 years, sponsored by the current speaker coming up, Representative Chris Sauls, who brought not only Madras to talk in front of the committees in the House and the Senate, but also a gentleman by the name of Berenson, who wrote a book called Tell Your Children, which is ironically the original name of the movie Reefer Madness, the documentary that was turned into a film which became eventually satire called Reefer Madness, as they went ahead and edited and changed the film around. And Mr. Madras Mr. Berenson Mather's basic premise is that cannabis is an evil drug, and again, it causes psychosis, and so therefore we do not want it out there for adult use, unless of course you reduce the THC levels in all cannabis sold to less than 10%, and thus comes their impetus for the cap bills, as we heard before. But in regards to psychosis, and you can go ahead and put the picture of Victor right now.
Yeah, and this is basically what started it all. This guy started it all. This is Victor Lacada. And he was basically a crazy guy, just a schizophrenic that became a schizophrenic because it ran in his family, and just so happened to use cannabis to medicate for this stuff. But apparently he was like, I heard he was like smoking weed with a 13-year-old boy. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a rumor I heard out here in Ybor. He was smoking weed with a 13-year-old, and that was the night that he just decided to take an axe and murder his entire family. We're actually two blocks away. We're a couple of blocks from the house that it actually happened. And yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Well, you're not too far off from the actual story, because I had a chance to read the police reports, which wasn't easy because they had actually stolen the entire case file, including the mugshots, from the Ybor City Police Department. And for a long time, they had trouble finding it because they needed it for the trials when he was in prison. And what happened was that Victor, at the age of 17, suddenly got the same disease that his older brother Oscar did when Oscar broke up a school. And his mother, Costanza, who was a major socialite in the Italian part of Ybor City, made certain that he was able to be given to her recognizance and be treated at home, which they were doing actually using cannabis. And there was a time when reporters were talking to 13-year-olds in Ybor City and saw that there was a preponderance of adult use recreational cannabis being distributed, and there was a lack of cannabis available in the neighborhood. And when Victor, who was already in trouble again for breaking up his school, just throwing chairs and things around, was brought home, and there was no cannabis to help him with his illness, which we now call bipolar disorder, but what they call precox dementia precox rather, which means it's early dementia. He actually killed his mother and his father and his sister with an axe, for which he was sent to jail for the rest of his life. And because they had found remnants of cannabis in a house, the story that had come out was that cannabis drove the man crazy and caused him to kill his parents, and was the basis for his psychosis, even though his brother had gotten it and his uncle, who happened to be related in more than one way to his mother, because cousins had married, did also have this situation. And so we've got these issues of the fact that people have been making some kind of connection between people who have psychosis and people who use cannabis, and actually using it to demonize them.
So, and the point of all that long-winded stuff is
this is story, it's history.
Basically to show in detail that this is probably the longest running stigma for cannabis. And you, Greg, I know you've been working to get rid of the stigma for quite some time. And recently, a study was done on the subject, and you wrote an article on this. Well, go ahead and share the screen.
Yeah, and I had no idea that fellow from Tampa had a history of using cannabis for medicinal purposes. I mean, that story about him, all I know is sort of the front end of it. I'm not surprised that Anslinger's people hid the records on that, because it's kind of how they came around and did things. It's a tragic story. There's a lot of tragedy that happens in life that sometimes gets misappropriated to, our favorite demon, different drugs, especially cannabis. When I started school in the mid-90s, and so I never became like a neurologist, or like, I wouldn't say that I'm a schizophrenia. My focus of my work on that is that focus of my work has been on cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. But I always wanted and hoped that my work as a young grad student, where I'm taking the brains out of animals and studying neuroscience, that it would help to would lead to some sort of treatments and therapies for people with profound neurological or psychiatric conditions. And schizophrenia has always been something I've thought a lot about. And the topic that's come up, like you said, a really interesting paper came out speaking on this at a time when I was, it dropped in my inbox because I get email alerts from the Journal of the American Medical Association, among other things. And it was a nice little review or look into reanalysis of papers that have looked at the connection between cannabis and schizophrenia. Starting off with a historical review, it's a little scattered, just kind of early, but I think it's really appropriate, Gary, how you start into that history, because that is where the whole latter half of the 20th century, war on cannabis got its legs, through sensationalizing that story and similar ones. And then, in the cannabis was most effectively criminalized by the Marijuana Tax Act, right, in 1937. And aside from that kind of story getting sensationalized, wasn't it, there's like a psychologist from Temple University who testified that he smoked marijuana and he turned into a bat and flew around the room.
That was Dr. Munch.
That was his testimony. And not that he like started really feeling crazy. He stated that he turned into a bat. And that kind of thing fed into the popular imagination about cannabis, and coincided with a massive campaign to remove its presence from the medical establishment. And I mean, there's many tangents we could go into here, like how that happened, but so much of the fuel behind Reefer Madness was this notion that cannabis, it causes a descent into madness, into psychosis, schizophrenia. It goes back a long time, I mean, when you look at ancient history and writings about cannabis as medicine, which those of us who have advocated for sane approaches to cannabis, often do. I mean, we love to look at how the human cannabis relationship dates back before recorded history. But even there, there are some of these fragments of like references to cannabis use as medicine in ancient China, also make reference to the notion that it can, stir demons, or make you lose your mind.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a paper, a great look at, I think it's the Sumerian text, the Sumerian references to cannabis. They had like, I don't know, multiple different names for it. Professor Meshulam has a great article that mentions this in the title, called Ganzen Gunu, where among the different names for cannabis in like the Assyrian or Sumerian sort of cultures, which were massive cultures, they lasted for centuries, right? And cannabis was hugely prominent, maybe the most important botanical medicine that they used. And there were many different names for it. They seemed to sort of map out what it was being used for. And Ganzen Gunu, apparently, transliterated, means that which takes away the mind. So that, on the one hand, can point to, it's long been known that cannabis is a potently psychoactive drug. And one certainly shouldn't go too far as to what that ancient writing means. I mean, maybe it means taking you out of your head in a good way, to sort of no longer obsess about the details. But my point is, there is conspiracy theory, right? We deal with it more. It's so much in our face right now, related to politics and the imaginations of global cabals or whatever else. But cannabis has suffered from the conspiracy theory that it causes schizophrenia for a long time, and it has had enormous real world impact because of the fear that it is like a time bomb that can make young people lose their minds. And the evidence is, it's understandable that such a psychoactive experience can make people worried that it would do that, because the beauty of cannabis includes that you can't die from it, but you can take such a enormous dose of THC that you feel like you're losing it. If you're not comfortable with the experience, or know that you'll ride it out and it'll all be fine, there's, we all know this, right? You take way too much, you can absolutely be controlled with anxiety and paranoia. But that kind of thing fuels an association. I mean, a the idea that it causes schizophrenia. So does the statistical associations that can come out. The first one appearing in the 80s or so, that there was a study of Swedish soldiers and showed that more of them, that those who had developed schizophrenia, were slightly more likely than those who didn't to have used cannabis. And so this sort of validated the long-time assumption in the minds of policymakers, right? It's like, well, it makes you crazy.
Yeah. In fact, the Schaefer report, when it came out in 1972, had mentioned the fact that in an opinion poll in 1972, 48% of the country believed the cannabis use leads to psychosis, leads to mental illness.
It's weird for me to really think about that in this day and age, because we're really like segregated and in this bubble nowadays. The Facebook algorithm doesn't show me people that are voting for Trump or people that are against cannabis and things like that. So we really are this country that's divided. And within the cannabis community, the idea that weed makes you go crazy is just like absurd. Like Reefer Madness is, you know, one of these longest running jokes. Like, we should totally get high and watch Reefer Madness because it's so funny. It's so outlandish. They totally go crazy when they smoke that joint. But I mean, it's weird for me being in my little bubble to think that like people out there actually think that weed makes you go crazy. And it's absolute, that within itself is crazy to me. And but this is a real thing. Like, people nowadays still think that you smoke a joint and you go nuts. I remember looking at this meme that like the No to Pot campaign came out with. You guys remember that, where it's like, I smoked a joint and now I'm gay.
It's something, but
it's a marketing tool.
Yeah, but you're touching on a real an important piece that you still have to, different sides have to engage, right? And it's not, the Reefer Madness is toned down a little bit, although, Gary, you mentioned it ironic being that Berenson's book used that term, "Don't Tell the Children." Of course, he knew very well that was the original title of Reefer Madness. It's like he was actually, well, the irony to me, or the shocking nature, is that it's weird to me that someone would actually invoke that in any way as though it were like a history to stand on. I mean, because it was nothing but propaganda. But the point is, those supporting cannabis as medicine, or reform of cannabis policy, can't just live only in their bubble and think like, well, this is all figured out and there's no risk, and we're just going to keep steaming in towards full on expansion of access to cannabis, because the fears of others are real. And these are not small scientific studies, that such as the one that came out in the Lancet in 2019, that have led to the idea. I'm sorry?
That's the DeForty article you're talking about?
Yeah, the article by DeForty and colleagues. Is a senior author was a Dr. Robin Murray, who's a very prominent figure in the writings about cannabis and psychosis out of Imperial College in London. This article has fueled the notion that cannabis of over 10% concentration THC should not be accessible, because that goes over the line. Reefer Madness, or the notion of causality between cannabis and schizophrenia, has just taken the slightly more nuanced approach of, well, as long as it's not too potent, because this isn't your daddy's weed, it's much stronger than it used to be, and now we know if more and more people are using it, we're going to see this epidemic of psychosis. And in fact, those authors really took the liberty of trying to calculate what percent of psychosis in different parts of Europe were due to high potency cannabis. it was really a shocking amount of liberty taken with a scientific article. But you have people with very prestigious scientific careers, like Dr. Madras, someone I've studied under it for a brief period of time, and highly politically important people who see high THC products. They are nervous about the wave of legalization, and it's possible that in places like Florida or in certain areas that they could be convinced by the scientific approach of saying that we need to dial back what's available, or prevent higher potency cannabis from being available, and just legalize a sort of cannabis light, with under 10% THC or CBD only, or that kind of thing.
And I saw this comment that I put up on the screen by Johnny on the Facebook live stream that kind of put a point forward to me that not the idea that cannabis causes schizophrenia, with the fact that it can be helpful for many mental conditions, can do a lot of harm. And there's a lot of doctors that you're talking about, a lot of people that have basically, I mean, I'm assuming have given an oath not to cause any harm, right? Maybe I'm talking about the wrong kind of doctor. But these people are really hurting. There's a lot of people here that aren't getting their medicine because they're reporting that cannabis can cause this schizophrenia.
Of course, we have from the time of period from the 30s up through now, practically, actually about 10 years ago, we suffered from a severe research deficit when it came to cannabis, in part because of the fact that they put a hold on most cannabis research by preventing anybody from having even the precursors to work with in regards to testing anybody. But then they also had skewed research, like in the 50s, where they took 6 gentlemen who were already in a mental institution and asked them, have you used cannabis? And therefore made the assumption that it was the cannabis that caused their mental illness. These are the type of research designs we've had to deal with all these years, because again, even when the Controlled Substance Act came out, they asked people to do only research on harm. And it's the NIDA, the good folks over under NIH who work on drug abuse, have basically only been talking about harm and never necessarily looking into research as to how things can help. Isn't that basically one of the situations we're dealing with, Greg?
Well, yeah. I mean, with the Controlled Substance Act, by virtue of cannabis being inappropriately in Schedule 1, I mean, that is never, ever really been based on science. It was contrary, as you know, and mentioned, to the findings of the Schaefer Commission, which was appointed by Richard Nixon really entirely because there were enough members of Congress that were doubtful that cannabis should be so heavily restricted. So it's like the president was charged to appoint a special committee, which he did, stacking it in his own interest, to find evidence that cannabis should be strictly prohibited, and they ended up ruling or finding that it should not be. And I simplify it, but I'm comfortable that anybody looking up that actual history will see that we know what we're talking about with this. Cannabis should never have been Schedule 1, but by virtue of that, it got locked down in this super restrictive mode. And the only institute of the National Institutes of Health that are allowed to work with those Schedule 1 drugs, at least at first, or to sponsor research for it, was the National Institute on Drug Abuse. But cannabis has an interesting, it's always had a unique level of prohibition on this because it is a botanical. And so it was through contract with NIDA that the only source of botanical cannabis for research can be grown. So you had this multi-step gauntlet to prevent any research with cannabis per se, controlled research. And frankly, in the 1980s, and of course earlier than that, the Controlled Substance Act is from 1970. For those first 20 years or so, honestly, researching drug abuse and drug addiction was not a glamorous direction for a neuroscience, an academic neuroscientist lab to do. It was kind of looked down the nose of, other neuroscience people pioneering how the mechanics of the brain work. As I've heard from many of my, senior colleagues who were present back then, it was looked down on because the academic neuroscience community, neuropharmacology community, realized how politically biased and motivated it was, and they just saw it as weak science. Looking at a mouse running around in a box and making conclusions about neural, mechanisms. But
what is the intent
changed.
of the mouse?
Yeah, well, that's changed in some ways, and so much has been discovered about the mechanics of the brain over the last 20 years. And as far as cannabis goes, the discovery of the endocannabinoid system shifted everything. We came to understand these receptors that THC works on and the endocannabinoids that act like THC. And, we are definitely in a different era now. Any of the national institutes study endocannabinoids. The research on the endocannabinoid system is massive, including how cannabinoids could be therapeutic. But for many years, there was that very clear lockdown. And even so, research is greatly biased to look at harms related to cannabis as opposed to therapeutic effects that could come from cannabis or other aspects of supporting the endocannabinoid system. Anyway, when it comes to this paper, I think what's important to, in the article that I wrote that cued this conversation, it is true that there are associations between using cannabis frequently in one's teenage years and the likelihood of developing psychosis or schizophrenia. One of the most really interesting and I think open-minded directions that have emerged is scientists looking at this with a more open mind to parse it out and saying, well, there are multiple possibilities here. One is the direct causality idea that has been sold to us, that using cannabis creates psychosis where it did not exist, that it just causes it. It's this descent into madness. Secondly, that maybe the association is more complicated than that, that there are family history matters, genetics, or environmental associations that drive it. And there have been some good, really interesting studies, also really well done in prestigious medical centers and well published, peer-reviewed, showing that the causality may be in a reverse direction. And this can be a hard thing to wrap your head around, but there is evidence that people who are predisposed, for lack of a better word, to develop schizophrenia, they have genetic risk factors, some of which we know a lot, more and more about, some of which we don't. But individuals who have risk factors for schizophrenia for years prior to developing that first psychotic break, they have this what's called a prodromal symptomology, or the schizophrenia prodrome. And certain symptoms of schizophrenia come on, like anhedonia and apathy. We call them when you're talking about schizophrenia, we call these the negative symptoms, not because they're bad and the positive symptoms are good, but the schizophrenia is broken up into these things. The positive symptoms are said to be things where there's something created that doesn't actually exist, like hallucinations and paranoia. Those are called positive symptoms, not because they're good, but because they've added something to the mind of the individual that isn't real. The negative symptoms are those that take away from the sufferer or the patient. And excuse me, this is where you get emotional blunting of your affect and not feeling pleasure and just being apathetic, which is something that also kind of blends over with just the teenage experience at times. So, the possibility here, which has been supported by good scientific work that is chosen to look for it, is, you know, you put yourself in the shoes of someone with, say, a teenager who's gotten withdrawn, and, you know, they're grumbly, they're apathetic, they're going through whatever funk, maybe, and especially if you have this family history of schizophrenia or some other kind of psychotic disorder. I mean, you see how this plays out. You know, you discover Johnny has been smoking weed, and then that leads to a troubled, you know, history where he ends up going psychotic. I think it's natural to blame the substance, especially when you've been conditioned to think that that's what marijuana does. But the reality that has been supported by some really credible research is that someone who's got that prodromal, you know, genetic predisposition is already someone who may be drawn to the therapeutic effects of cannabis, that they find some good outcome from self-medicating with cannabis. And that in and of itself is enough to drive the statistical association. That's not to say that their cannabis habit can't help precipitate the psychotic break, because these people are vulnerable to going into psychosis. And, you know, something that doesn't get said enough is, you know, this association exists for cigarettes, right? People who are predisposed to cannabis and become, you know, heavy cigarette smokers, that also associates with their psychotic break. Going to college is statistically associated with schizophrenia. That kind of brand new environment away from home, the stress of the experience, social, academic, you know, you name it.
I totally went
These
crazy
become,
when I went to college.
You what?
I totally went crazy when I went to college.
Well, it is a pressure that is associated with the onset of psychosis, and that is, you know, it has not driven any political campaign to, you know, prevent kids from going to college because it's a slippery slope into madness, because people naturally have a more nuanced look to it. You know, when you should have more social, so maybe it should be informing the public health approach at the college, and that the psychological support for students should keep in mind that, you know, freshman year of college is a chance where somebody who's been prodromal might be more likely to become psychotic. And quite honestly, you know, people who have a family history of psychotic disease, or they have already been diagnosed with sort of a pre-schizophrenic schizotypal personality, you know, should certainly be very cautious with cannabis. I mean, I'm not here giving, you know, formal medical advice. It's a tricky question. If someone finds therapeutic benefit, but there's some reason to believe that maybe it could cause, you know, a trigger. It could be a triggering event. You know, these people should not be smoking packs of cigarettes. They shouldn't be diving into, you know, doing high dose dab rips
So
on a daily
folks
basis.
who are predisposed to habituations
Yeah.
should try to stay away from things that are actually physically addicting.
I think
it's interesting to me too, because you I think you actually kind of mentioned a little bit about this, but like, you know, as an activist, I kind of think every time somebody badmouths cannabis, there's some sort of malicious intent involved there. But I mean, if you think about it from the point of view of the patient in this case, it's hard to blame myself. It's easier to blame a substance, you know?
And it's hard to blame your child.
Yeah.
You know, and that's driven so much, you know, really highly motivated parents have driven so much political change. They motivated, you know, the influence that Mothers Against Drunk Driving had is huge. The influence that parents driving political change when their kid has had something terrible happen to them, and they can blame it on the outside substance of cannabis, is enormous. It's really hard to blame your child for something when the evil weed is right there, because blaming your child is kind of blaming yourself too, right? It's like, I didn't do it was in my genes, or I didn't do the right thing. And you know, I'm a very holistically thinking person. Like, you got to think broader than that. These are difficult things, but blame isn't something. You know, it's situational, but
it's not even necessarily blame. Like, I can't, you know, if I'm a schizophrenic, I don't think I can blame myself for being a schizophrenic. It's just kind of something that happens. I don't necessarily, like, I'm not entirely familiar with the condition, but you know, I'd imagine like I don't become a schizophrenic because like I you know, you know, had some bad habit or something like that.
No, like atheism.
It's like, you're schizophrenic.
Well, we are going to
God.
deal with this argument in the next coming legislative session. They are going to bring back that 10% cap back. Bertha Madras and Berenson are going to come back and discuss the 4T article, and they are going to push the fact that there is, in their minds, there is either a definite link between psychosis and cannabis, or there's just not enough information to belay that possibility. Yeah. And yet, pharma, I'm sorry for a second, the big pharma is actually one of our enemies in this particular instance, because that they see cannabis as a threat. And yet we know that there is definitely connections between medical use and the onset of, say, for instance, bipolar disorder, or like tardive dyskinesia is is an aspect of use of particular antipsychotics. Now, my daughter happened to have severe migraines, and they gave her lamotrigine and amitriptyline, olanzapine, Effexor, doxepin, Topamax, and Geoton all at the same time to try to get those. And now she is diagnosed with bipolar issues, and she had frontal lobe depression, according to the neurologist that we spoke with. And so there is actually almost a more blatant connection between current psychotropics and current antidepressives to psychosis, perhaps, than cannabis. Or is it another one of those situations of reverse causality?
That's a good question. And you know, there's kind of someone who's like a classically trained pharmacologist. There's kind of a cult of pharmacology in this country about how, you know, that there's this mystique about the drug, the drug industry, the pharma industry. We love them and we hate them, but there's certainly different standards applied. You know, you don't have an addiction disorder to a benzodiazepine if it's prescribed. That takes you out of what's, you know, the diagnostic criterion. If it's prescribed, it's not an addiction. And I remember early when we were getting these CBD only laws, right? And Florida was trying to push for its first version, even though it was CBD only. And I remember seeing this woman who was an Ivy League doctor, I think a emergency doc in Dartmouth or something, saying she was greatly concerned about the use of CBD in these epileptic kids, because we just don't know long term what the outcome is going to be. And yet there are experiments going on with our population with molecular psychiatry all the time. I mean, you get different drugs being, you get these cocktails of drugs like you were mentioning, and we don't know the long-term effects of 3 or 4 or 5 of these drugs at once, but it still is something that physicians are giving the discretion to practice medicine and do their best with the information that's there. And you talk about this 10% THC issue coming up, and I agree. I think it will come back up. And the thing about why the study that I highlighted in this article I wrote for Project CBD, people can find it on projectcbd.org.
There's a link right there.
Why I was delighted to see it is because this article by 2 different authors, you know, they looked at this question, they broke it down very clearly, and said that they clearly were able to refute the idea that cannabis is just like a match that starts psychosis. It's a simple cause and effect. They think that there's definitely evidence that there could be more of the reverse causality, that people who are pre-schizophrenic are also driven to be more likely to use cannabis. But that anyway, at any rate, it's confounded. at worst, cannabis use can act something as maybe an accelerant to people who are to young people who are already predisposed or more likely to experience it. And there's some important points to bring out. One, it is certainly a very different issue because the vast majority of users and the population in general are not going to become psychotic with or without cannabis. But secondly, this question of creating a high-low boundary of 10% it's a fallacy. It's artificial, and the article that is fueling this latest round of saying there's a 10% cap was a study that came out in Lancet Psychiatry in 2019. The House, is he still the Speaker, Ray Rodriguez in Florida? He's pushed this.
He's a senator now, and he's going to be pushing it again. He just went from one house to the other.
And importantly, physicians get influenced by these studies. And what they did, I mean, honestly, what the work did, I think, is just add one other piece to show that heavy cannabis use can promote first onset psychosis in people who have first onset psychosis. The reverse causality question could very well be at play, very well. This study was conducted in many different multiple countries. It calls itself a European study, but it included Brazil. And they basically recruited the participation of many different wellness. I can't remember if they were particularly psychiatric centers or hospitals, but basically psychiatric wards, and documented people coming in with a first case of psychosis. And then the investigators at these different multiple places in different countries, Spain, Netherlands, England, Brazil, France, they followed similar protocols to survey the patients and find out about their cannabis use. And they were asked to explain what kind of cannabis they used. And the decision was made to use to allow people to use their own language, right? And they use colloquial terms for whatever they used to talk about homegrown or hashish, or in UK they talk about skunk. And what happened next, I think, is where there's a real breakdown in the scientific strength of where they went with it, because they correlated what people said about their cannabis products with national sort of police records of how strong that substance should be. And this isn't obvious in the paper. I mean, you read the paper and it's just saying, we found out that people who used very high THC cannabis were more likely to have psychosis. I mean, I don't want to simplify what the paper says, because it's actually hard to read for people who don't really follow scientific literature. And for me, when I see a paper that requires pages of tables of statistics to even show that their results mean anything, you kind of have to wonder how strong it is. But again, and it becomes tricky to even talk about. But my point is, when I started looking very into references within the references, it's like in the supplementary material that doesn't even show up in the paper. You got to go to the website and link to the supplementary material to show how they figured all this out. You see that, hash in Brazil was given a low THC value. Hash in Spain was a high THC. Homegrown in London was considered potent, but elsewhere it wasn't. Skunk was over 10%, but imported weed in London was lower than 10%. And like, where do you find this? And I traced it back. They're citing things like these government white papers by European Parliament about how to track potency of cannabis. And these things, that's where the transparency stopped. It was like, according to the national police in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is in the 15 years ago. That's where their potency of cannabis came from, or from even much more recently, confiscated skunk weed in London, tested higher than 10% THC. But my point that I think should resonate with anybody affiliated with the cannabis industry is that cannabis testing is hard. This is notorious, right? The silent shopper programs of testing how much CBD or THC is in a product. You send it to a lab and you're going to get different results. And a lot of that is technical. You have to calibrate these machines. You have to have reference standards for THC to make sure that your rulers are working right and you know how much is there. And the idea that national, like police, or we have no idea how long these cops or had the product in their lockers, or what was the chain of custody to show what these percentages were,
and how was it stored, of course.
How was it stored? What were their reference standards? Because it's not easy to get those standards. You got to have a DEA. It's ridiculous to think that this was was a more accurate way.
Even if you use the same machine and you cut a bud in half, right, and then you just test those two buds separately, you're going to get different results still.
You have to use, and labs deal with this all the time, you have to use validated methods. That's a jargon term. To use a validated method means everything: how you grind it, how humid it is, how much moisture content, how it's dissolved and mixed up and put into the HPLC, what the protocols you use, how fast it gets pushed along this little separator. You have to use a protocol, stick with it, and validate it by showing that it works. And none of that has come into play as far as I can tell with that paper. And yet it came to a very specific, arbitrary distinction that 10% is this sort of high-low boundary. And that's what allowed them to tease some results out. Because clearly, if they look at the lower than 10%, there's no link to psychosis. Like, they couldn't make that stretch. That's where you draw a boundary and say, well, can we find it? And I'm putting words in their mouth, but I have reason to be cynical about this work. I think you put this 10% boundary and say, now we find it. It's only with the potent weed, and we do all these different statistics, and you start to find this statistical association with when they weren't even looking at psychosis. They were looking at just a singular episode of, they weren't looking at schizophrenia. They were looking at a singular first episode of psychosis, which could have been somebody who, for all we know, was still, suffering the after effects of eating way too many cookies. Maybe they tried to control for that. These aren't dumb people that do it. They're not. And these papers, this one in particular, has the mystique of tremendous prestige because it's in like 8 different countries. And so you get all these national funding, institutes listed on the paper, and many different authors. And as I make a note in my article in Project CBD, that sometimes has greater political influence than the details of the science itself. Look how impactful this, and not just influencing politicians, but influencing people like the state medical boards that have huge influence in lobbying to make change. And so addressing it with a clear head and with like modern scientific rationale and methodology is so important. That's why I'm happy to sing the praises and help translate the findings of these authors that published the new study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, because the notion that this reverse causality idea that being a likely schizophrenic actually enhances your likelihood of using cannabis, rather than you got duped into using cannabis and now you're schizophrenic. That reverse causality is very grounded in rigorous, intelligent scientific analysis, and the entire field needs to be interpreted with that in mind. that needs to be part of the lens that the entire history of linking cannabis and psychosis is viewed through, regardless of your political, background or inclination. And so you got to have these breakdowns on that level, using that scientific language to temper the notions that get thrown at these rulemaking processes. I mean, it's easy to say, "Oh, dude, the cat's out of the bag. The toothpaste is out of the tube. You're not going to be able to put a new clamp down and restriction on THC products," but it could happen. It absolutely could happen. And I am not doing this out of, I do have personal and financial interest in the cannabis industry now. But I'm not saying any of this because I'm planning on getting rich off of high THC products. It's just important for us to understand that bugaboo doesn't justify it's being used to justify, to try and accomplish. And also, probably one of my next articles that I really want to get ahead on is just this fascination we have with percents anyway. Marinol has been an FDA-approved medicine for decades, and if you want to just look at percent THC, it's over 95% THC. I mean, it's THC in a pill. So
is like, I remember when the state of Florida first came out with medical marijuana, and like flower wasn't allowed, but I could buy dabs, and like it made no sense whatsoever. Greg, I gotta ask you too, man. So we're talking a lot about THC and the 10% cap, and how it's, it could be helpful for the brain, but it's, it's the cap is based off of this stigma or whatnot. What about other cannabinoids? Me and Gary have a mutual friend that's been using CBG to help restore some brain functions. At least that's his claim. I want to know how useful are these cannabinoids in treating schizophrenia, not necessarily THC, but the whole gamut,
We don't really know how useful it is in treating schizophrenia, other than that people with schizophrenia have reported that they use cannabis for, and find benefit from it. And this creates a certain irony. If it does advance the disease in some cases, is it a case of using something that you find improves your quality of life, but may lead to a greater diagnosis down the way? As far as honing in on a cannabinoid like CBG, I don't know. This is such an exciting moment of where we could research and explore therapeutic, potentials for other cannabinoids. We have no doubt that there's lots of therapeutic potential for other cannabinoids. I haven't really seen a good case for CBG being useful for schizophrenia, but I'm not going to dismiss that if someone's experience, they're getting good effect, that maybe there's something there. I think there's a real responsibility and opportunity as cannabis policy is reforming and you're getting this industry come into place, that the cannabis industry needs to take the lead in trying to research, and that includes what we call pharmacovigilance research, to follow through on potential risks, right? We should be collecting data on what cannabis users, experience. And, if we come to find out that certain cannabinoid, content is associated with a greater likelihood for some sort of risk, then the industry needs to be able to help find that. But back to your specific question, no, I don't know about CBG and any psychiatric diagnosis. I've known some people who have been using high CBG tinctures and extracts, and really like the way they make them feel. I've heard people say like, oh, I feel really confident with it. I'm interested in exploring CBG. We'll be seeing so much more of that because, I'm sure most of your listeners are aware, and you definitely are, Carlos, working with a CBD store. CBG is everywhere right now. I mean, the 2020 hemp growing season included much more access to seeds that would produce high CBG flower. And there's a whole lot of it that was planted. There's a whole lot of it coming down in harvest this year. And there's going to be lots of CBG out there. So I'm really interested to see how well, with so many like app-based, survey research that goes on, what we will tease out of it. As far as like the really rigorous research with CBG, I mean, there's evidence that shows it could be beneficial in prostate cancer. There's evidence that shows that it is useful. It has strong antibiotic properties like other cannabinoids do, but CBG is really one that's gotten, some signal in these studies looking at like properties against like MRSA, meth-resistant Staph aureus. And we'll just have to be careful. I mean, we'll see where that goes, right? It doesn't mean necessarily, that probably has applications in healthcare settings.
Well, you made an interesting point when you brought out the disclaimer that I'm not really involved in the cannabis industry. Well, you are, but not to the extent where you'll be actually trying to make any money off of doing these articles for CBG. We have a lot of studies out there that suffer from what I called sponsorship bias, which basically means that studies cost money. If they're not being done at a university level and being put through a general silo, generally you have a drug company or somebody else who sponsors that study and therefore comes up with what I call the Von Daniken effect, where you come to a foregone conclusion and then you find cherry-picked evidence.
My pharmacology classes, and I was interested to see how some of these kids would recognize and say, well, this was funded by the National Center on Drug Abuse, so you can't trust that it's biased. And that would put me in the devil's advocate seat, because I mean, it doesn't mean that it's biased, but and these were very type A, like pre-med students. They weren't like just people who wanted to support, cannabis. But yeah, the point is, science always has benefactors, and whether it's, I'm getting a little caught up in my head trying to think of historical examples, like René Descartes, who invented calculus and was a tremendous philosopher. I mean, he paid his bills at one time in his life, by being a tutor to the children of royalty. I mean, we all have benefactors, but the notion is I think the importance is that the method of science is left to be objective and blinding yourself. This is the importance of blinding scientists to research, whether it's clinical or in a lab. And it's not always done. But bias sneaks in very pernicious ways, right? And back to the case in point, the funding for looking at cannabis has been for decades targeted towards finding negative outcomes. And that absolutely does factor in the hypotheses that you propose, how you run the tests in the lab or the clinic, and how you interpret them in the discussion papers of your article. Because a scientist is going to think, if I don't continue to at least point in the direction of the hypothesis that cannabis will cause addiction or will cause craziness or what have you, then my likelihood of continuing funding is going to be diminished. I mean, it absolutely has been this pernicious bias driving research, and that's part of my, bottom line, that I always end up praising and getting so excited about the discoveries of the endocannabinoid system, because discovering the endocannabinoids has like liberated cannabis from this strictly drug abuse paradigm, because now you're looking at this mechanism of homeostasis and well-being in the body and asking, if we tweak that system with drug use, how does it affect things? And it's different. When I first started reading the scientific literature on cannabis 25 years ago, and looking backwards too in the writings, the papers, first of all, there were much fewer scientific articles, and you could actually read and know all of them, but they always started the same way, like cannabis is the most used illegal drug in the world, and then everything started shifting, where the first paragraph of those articles were like, cannabis has been used therapeutically for thousands of years, but we need to know more about it. So the whole tone has changed in research. I mean, it's still probably biased towards finding harms, but there's lots of outlets out there to research medical and therapeutic, mechanisms of the endocannabinoid system, and it's not all pigeonholed into the negative.
Well, if I had to pick one phrase we heard more than any other phrase in the whole debate in regards to caps in the last 2 years, is we have to follow the science.
Right.
And the question is whether that science is rightful or not, if it's biased or not. And when it comes up again this next coming session, and I'm certain that it will, I know that they're going to bring back Berenson. If you're up to it, I'd love to see it. I would buy the popcorn to see you debate Berenson on the topic with his intuition and your actual science.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, now I live up in West Virginia, and I'm less inclined to go to Tallahassee, but
we'll see if the speaker will pay for you to come down, because he pays for Berenson to come anyway.
Well, Berenson has been he's appeared in some public events that did not go his way. Professor Mitch Earlywine has spoken head to head with him. Peter Grinspoon has given head to head sort of a critique of Berenson. Some other guy was on the Joe Rogan podcast with Berenson. These arguments have been made, but you're right. The catchphrase is we have to follow the science, and that's why it's so important that there is science out there saying if you follow the science, you can't blame cannabis like it's a smoking gun. So following the science means, hey, why don't you put some money towards actual public health education and putting this kind of dialogue out there instead of pumping millions into, hey, smoke weed and drive, we'll give you a ticket. I mean, there needs to be a real public health direction towards it. I mean, I agree that cannabis policy is changing in many different ways. It's being more accessible to people. And there may be other health concerns that pop up about that, but follow the science and you'll see that it doesn't create a, spiraling health crisis of psychosis. It doesn't create increases in addiction or even increases in teen use in states that legalize. And you may have more people in car crashes that have THC in their system when it's more widely used, but if you follow the science, putting people on closed courses driving, whether they've used 10% cannabis or 8% cannabis or, a 60% THC vape pen, there's not science really. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think somebody should be plugging up a dab rig into their car and taking a real high dose and driving. But ultimately, I mean, I don't think somebody should take a prescription antihistamine and drive either until, and this is where the rubber hits the road for me when it comes to that. We should have a similar standard that cannabis should have warning labels that you don't drive or operate machinery until you know how this medicine affects you. And after that, it's like these other drugs that can make you sleepy. But again, follow the science on this 10% THC cap. It's just not it's not grounded. It's not realistic. There's always been cannabis that's higher than 10%. I mean, yeah, it was less, the cannabis has become much more sophisticated, starting with widespread growing of sinsemilla. I mean, just having the agronomy down where males are separated and you get these big, luscious female flowers that don't have seeds in them, that in itself doubles the potency of THC, and that in the coming in the 80s when you started getting more controlled breeding and growing like that enhanced potency. But that didn't mean that people weren't smoking greater than 10% weed in the 60s and 70s. We should monitor the notion. High potency THC is around, and it needs to be viewed professionally, but just putting some cap that will completely change the experience that people I'm not sure what even all the motivations of that are, but it is not scientifically proven that using 15% THC is getting on the route to psychosis. That's the bottom line of it. That the science does not support that.
No, it comes back to this quite often. It's that we need more research, and it's an interesting stigma that this is actually something that the guys that are trying to point their finger at us actually need to research a little bit more and be a little bit more thorough on their findings. So it's an interesting topic,
Yeah, but we want to thank Dr. Greg Gerdeman, PhD, neuroscientist, and really smart cannabis guy, for coming in and helping decipher this, because this is going to be the battle we have this next session. We have a lot of bills we have to go through, and this one's going to be a major one.
Now, I put you down there as a neuroscientist because the article lists you as one, or calls you a neuroscientist, but you primarily consider yourself to be a biologist, right?
Well, yeah, I always have to wrestle with how to title myself.
Cannabis smart guy is a good way to go.
I'm an endocannabinoid OG. No, I come into this as someone studying the brain, and that was my direction. My PhD is in pharmacology. Probably would have been in neuroscience, but Vanderbilt didn't have a PhD degree in neuroscience at that time. But over the years, it was through my study of the brain and the mechanisms of how cannabis works that I gravitated into the medical cannabis movement, because it became clear to me that there not only is real evidence for cannabis as medicine, but I've helped to uncover some of it, that it's neuroprotective. I've been one element. My work was part of a whole convergence of work.
Well, this is a plant that requires
giving modern showing.
This plant requires obviously a highly multidisciplinary approach.
It does, and I've studied. I've had opportunities since I've been involved with one of the MMTCs in Florida, and I started as a chief scientist and app writer for Three Voice Farm, and during a time when I was going to be working on product formulations, I ended up leading integrated pest management in the greenhouse. So I spent over a year really working with the cannabis plant, sitting with great growers. Over time, in other contexts, I have people I call myself friends who I think are some of the most impactful cannabis breeders of the past 100 years. I've been really privileged to sit with a lot of experts. So I've developed a wide expertise in things related to the human cannabis relationship. And I consider just, I used to think neuroscience was just the most, that's where I've gotten the most fascination in my life, but studying the endocannabinoid system is even broader net than neuroscience, because it's throughout the body. It's a driving force in evolutionary change, in my view. And so I kind of consider myself, my good friend, Dr. Sunil Agarwal, kind of was the first to use the term cannabinology. And I like to consider myself a cannabinologist.
Well, we're both lucky to know you, man. And, you talk about how you've had the pleasure to work with a lot of great people. I can speak for Gary and myself when we say we're lucky to have worked with you and to consider you a friend.
Thanks, brother. It's good to get on here.
And of course, here comes the commercial. If you want to be part of the change in regards to cannabis and its legalization and all the things that need to be fixed in the current legislation in regards to employee protection, institutional protection, home grow possibilities, get involved by being a part of Suncoast Normal. We are a membership-driven organization, and for a short fee and going to suncoastnormal.org, you can become a member. And if you are a business who would like to see more of what we do here at the Rotation, become a patron, become a sponsor. Come and contact us, and we will tell you the ins and outs of how you can be on top of the situation.
Yeah, you could be featured in a commercial. You could be mentioned on the show. We could have you on as a guest on the actual show. So get in contact with us. There's tons of ways to promote your business as cannabis friendly and accepting of change. There's also other ways you can volunteer for Suncoast Normal. We got an event coming up in December that we're going to announce pretty soon. So we're going to need volunteers for those events, volunteers at other events representing the organization, things like that. Also follow us on social media at Suncoast Normal. That's NORML. On Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all of that stuff. It's at Suncoast Normal. That's NORML. And of course, our website again is www.suncoastnormalnorml.org.
And you get this really neat gold pin as a member of not only Suncoast Normal, but National Normal as well. The National Organization for the Reformation of Marijuana Laws. We try to get them to change it to cannabis laws, but no one likes the sound of Norcal. So I guess we're going to keep that with Normal. And you can be a part of it. You can be part of the change. Looking forward to having you on the Rotation next week.
And Greg, thanks for being on the show. Anything else you want to contribute here?
No, I'm good. I appreciate doing it. I don't normally do a webinar in the morning, so I think maybe been a little scattered at the beginning, but it's been good coming on. And I maybe I'll drop some things when you post this about my own, directions. I'm going to be doing a lot. Got some projects on cannabis education for the industry that is going to be going to be launched in the next, couple months that I'll be involved in and trying to talk up a lot. And otherwise, I just direct people to that Project CBD article, and that's a really great site that I've contributed to since before it became what it is. And I always point people to Project CBD as a great reference.
And I'll see if I can't get the new speaker to drag you out of Wheeling and bring you over here to speak up against Dr. Bertha Madras and Mr. Berenson. I say that with love.
No, I mean, it's actually, we should talk about it because I do have some interest in, obviously in Florida, and I want, that should not be where the state goes. I don't think it's likely, but you got to talk science.
We may even go back into that nanogram per milliliter of blood discussion as well, but that's the topic for another day.
Yeah, right. All right, gentlemen.
All right, guys.
I will let you go.
Take it easy.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Take care.